Hi, I'm George Abernathy, the proud president of FreightWaves. Thank you for joining us at the Health and Pharma Virtual Summit. I'm thrilled today. You guys are really going to be in for a treat over the next 20 to 25 minutes. Dr. Jonathan Ward is going to be joining us and talking about the impact of the pandemic around China and the US, but we're going to go a whole lot deeper and we're going to talk about the issues that were uncovered there and what that actually means downstream. Let me do a little bit of background on Dr. Ward so you can know just from where he's coming. Dr. Ward is an internationally recognized expert on Chinese global strategy and US-China competition. He's the founder and president of the Atlas Organization, a consultancy focused on US-China global competition, where he works with leading US businesses on strategy towards China and Asia. Following the release of his landmark book on Chinese grand strategy, China's Vision of Victory, Dr. Ward's commentary on US-China relations became featured widely on national and international television and print media. As a matter of fact, I think it was in January of 2020, Dr. Ward was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony of the US-China Phase 1 trade deal and was commended at a gathering of America's foremost business leaders for his work on China. So with that as the intro, Jonathan, thank you so much for doing this. We're really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here, and it's great to be with all your members.
So let's level set a little bit in our fireside chat here. FreightWaves has a lot to do in transportation. We have a lot to talk about in trucking companies. Why don't you give the folks a little bit of a view how some of your earliest interactions in Asia really related to trucking companies?
Well, George, it's great that we had a chance to talk about this earlier. And throughout my 20s, I spent about 5 years living out of a backpack in, China, India, Russia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And a lot of what I did back then was actually to travel with truck drivers. So I would go with long haul truckers around China, around the Middle East, all across Patagonia in South America. And it was a very great way for me to see countries and get to know people and, get to a very interesting side of life that most people never see. And that contributed enormously to my understanding not only of Asia, but of the wider world through my global travels. And I was always spending time with truck drivers. It was probably my favorite thing to do, was to go for long distances and did that for many times. So I have a deep how would you put it, respect and sort of love for the industry. I mean, it's just wonderful. So great to be here.
That's one of the things that folks domestically here will say. The folks who know the U.S. or North America the best are oftentimes those truck drivers, and boy, we certainly see and feel that here at FreightWaves. So we want to talk about obviously health and pharma. As you and I had chatted, we'll talk a little bit about supply chain. To me, one of the interesting parts is the pandemic was all unfolding was I've never heard supply chain talked about more in the common conversation or within the news. I joke that if we had a drinking game on the nightly news, that how many times the word supply chain was said, you'd be pretty well inebriated within the first 10 minutes or so. But let's take a step back to when what happened in the pandemic and how that really occurred, and then how that is now starting to impact on the U.S.-China relationship. So why don't you set the groundwork for us, like at the pandemic and as it moved itself forward?
Right, you bet. I mean, the pandemic, I think, has been a very important juncture in the US-China relationship because you already had essentially the deterioration of US-China relations, a geopolitical rivalry that has really been in the making for decades. I mean, China has had a grand strategy that was mostly unknown to Americans, where they sought to surpass us, to replace us as the dominant power worldwide, to do this through the use of our technology. I mean, all the technology transfer of the past decades is now coming back to be positioned against us through their industrial policies, their military buildup. I mean, they're designing a military that's built for combat with the United States in the Pacific and with their own neighbors all around Asia. And this is all essentially built off our technology and through our trade. So once you had the trade war, once you had the real reckoning on the US-China relationship, where we just said, look, we're not going to have this anymore, we have to change strategies, then suddenly, I mean, COVID goes across the world right in the aftermath of a trade deal, of sort of new footing on U.S. strategy towards China. And it's disrupted so many things since then, as we've all experienced. But the thing that it's really done, I think, is it start to cause businesses to rethink their supply chain dependencies on China. And even in a process where government was already beginning to rethink our national dependency on China. And at the forefront of all of that, of course, is the pharma industry and healthcare. And what's very important here is as pharmaceutical supply chains come under scrutiny, as there are public-private partnerships to deal with the China dependency. I mean, at this point, you have so many bills in Congress that are meant to address this. I think it provides a template that's going to be applied to other industries. I mean, if we can fix our medical supply chains and reduce or eliminate our dependency on China, eventually you apply that to other strategic industries. And in the meantime, China's use of the pandemic, I mean, the way that they see it, because I read a lot of party statements and such, they believe that it's put them in an advantageous position in the geopolitical competition with the United States. I mean, they've talked a great deal about turning crisis into an opportunity, which is an old sort of, military doctrine concept that they have. And, I think we at this point understand that we can't depend on China for, what many call critical products, but certainly for our medical supply chains. And whether it's the executive branch or the U.S. Congress, I mean, everybody, I think, is attending to this issue now. And it's going to be up to companies, to CEOs, to supply chain officers, to strategists to begin to find a new footing in a world where the U.S.-China relationship is coming apart, decoupling, and will not be put back together. We don't want to put it back together. I mean, it's a dangerous adversary state. So businesses are going to have to start understanding that and working around this. And supply chain is the tip of the spear in that entire problem set.
So it sounds like the circumstance with what happened to the pandemic and the impact on pharmaceutical supply, there was already movement towards that, and this may have shed a light that the government or some of the corporate institutions started to notice even more. So with what occurred and as that separation's occurring, where next should we be thinking about that this pharma clarion call? Where is it telling us to think about next? Is it technology? Is there no one or nothing that is being sourced in China today that will be the same downstream?
Well, I think one really has to think about it in terms of strategic industries. I mean, certainly there's been a focus on national security supply chains. So, critical technology that's an input to, the U.S. military or to allied militaries, that matters. But also, the prospect of in the long term losing more and more pieces of our industrial base, that has to be reversed now. So I think, the other side of what's happened as, U.S. government awakens to the problem of China dependency is, for decades, we've been offshoring the U.S. industrial base. We're going to have to bring it back. So I think to look at supply chains of the future, we have to also think about the entire prospect of reindustrializing the United States of America, to be doubling down on China investment as though that's part of a global economy, I think is senseless at this point. I mean, what you really need is to ensure that America is a leader not only in, for instance, in the pharma industry, medical innovation, but also in production and the ability to manufacture ourselves. I mean, that was one of the key points in what COVID-19 taught us, is that we have giant gaps in our industrial base. We were unable. I mean, if we all remember living through this in the early months, we did not have PPE. We did not have, ventilators. I mean, we weren't producing this stuff. It was coming from China. And what's worse was China actually, according to the Congressional Research Service, nationalized its, medical production facilities, and they took control of foreign companies' production lines and redirected them towards China. So they were clamping down on exports. They were buying up PPE around the world, and they nationalized their own industries. So you ask yourself, I mean, this is a country that, is building a military that's designed to fight us, that is, engaged in industrial policies that are meant to dominate the industries of the future, from robotics to biopharm to ICT. And, all of our Fortune 500s are over there with enough market share that it really matters to their thinking on their business globally. And this is a country that can nationalize It's in an entire industry. It can redirect exports. It can stop exports. It can even redirect foreign companies' production lines. So that tells you, from the standpoint of national security, or just being a country in general. I mean, being America, we can't depend on this place. We shouldn't, and that's leaving out the propaganda aspect, where you have official Communist Party mouthpieces talking about, if China wishes, they will plunge America into the sea, or rather, excuse me, plunge America into the inferno of coronavirus. I mean, this is what they're saying, as they also, devour Hong Kong and threaten Taiwan and kill Indian soldiers on their border. So we have this huge geopolitical problem, but we also have this economic issue where our dependency on China is so completely unsustainable that it forces us into one direction, which is we have to rebuild at home. And I think that's where the government is focused. I think that was true of Trump, and it's also going to be true of Biden. I mean, he's planned hundreds of billions of investment in infrastructure, R&D, and all sorts of things. So I think you're going to find actually a lot of bipartisan consensus on this. I mean, this really needs to be the work program for the U.S. government to start rebuilding at home. And what matters most is we need willing, I think, partners in business who are ready to start working on rebuilding America. And unfortunately, I think there is an element of many people want to go out and capture Chinese growth, but understanding what's unsustainable about that and how really the next decade is going to be about rebuilding here. That would be my opinion, based on what's gone on with China.
That the rebuilding of America really strikes a chord, and to hear, as you describe, and I'm not trying to have our conversation get too political, but that this is where the Trump administration was going, and it appears as if the Biden administration is going that. So that sounds like it is an accepted element that we all have to be aware of. So let's use pharma as the example. If we're going to need to be build it in America, construct in America, are you measuring this reconstruction, this move? Do you measure it in years, decades? Is there a vulnerability that comes that is exacerbated if we're measuring in decades? Does it need to occur in some sort of subset of years?
Well, I do think that based on the U.S.-China geopolitical competition, which, if we take that as the most important and significant geopolitical contest of our lifetimes, the time frame on that competition is really one in which this decade, the 2020s, is the most important, because this is the decade in which China could surpass the U.S. economically. It could build a military that reaches parity with our military. I mean, they could become a technology leader and an industry leader in a lot of critical areas. So it's really the 2020s. I like to call it the decisive decade. But this is the time in which we're going to have to, form a new U.S. grand strategy. We haven't had to do that really since the Cold War. We're going to have to focus on China, and above all, we're going to have to be incredibly capable in industrial capacity. I think it's something we've left behind because of globalization, but it has to come back now, because globalization never really foresaw the geopolitical problems of offshoring to adversary countries. But now we all understand what that is. And certainly the pandemic and the pharma sector have shown us the truth of all that. And it's also something important here is the pandemic has allowed, I think, U.S. government to dust off some very old but important policies and strategies, not least of which is the Defense Production Act. I mean, you look at the Defense Production Act, which has been invoked for the sake of the pandemic, and it's really about being able to produce here, being able to partner with industry. At the end of the day, our strength is our private sector. I mean, the Fortune 1000 is 2/3 of the U.S. economy. So we're going to have U.S. private sector working within a national security sort of set of parameters, where it's about we won't survive if we don't have an adequate industrial base and adequate self-sufficiency in critical industries. And that also means we can work with allies. I mean, it just means that we can't depend on China. So seeing the pharma industry begin to take that on board, I mean, seeing all the tight cooperation between governments and market leaders, I mean, that all, I think, sets a precedent here that you wouldn't have had without the pandemic. So in many ways, pharma's at the leading edge of how government and private sector can work together But I think we're going to see that across a wide number of industries. I mean, at the end of the day, it has always been our private companies that stepped in to meet our greatest geopolitical challenges, whether it was General Motors, powering us in the Second World War, or, whether it was DARPA in Silicon Valley. I mean, that sort of, entire tech constellation that was produced by government, but ultimately became, our world-leading private sector in tech. I mean, we've had a very long and healthy relationship between government and industry that goes back, decades now, and we're going to have to start doing that again. And I think that's a very different thing from how many multinationals look at the world. And it's going to be incumbent upon them to have a more realistic sense of what's driving that, why it's necessary, and why, the U.S.-China competition is going to drive, so much of what has to happen in our strategic industries. One other side to this, of course, is that in China, not only do you have massive state-owned enterprises, very well known, massive state banks, but the Communist Party in recent years under Xi Jinping is taking, really expanding its influence over its private companies. And we've all seen the Ant Financial Alibaba saga of the past few months. But the bottom line is its companies are being redirected into a program that they called civil military fusion, which means that the innovation that happens in the civilian economy becomes, is ultimately there for the taking for the Chinese military. So, and all kinds of companies you wouldn't think about. I mean, logistics companies are very important to civil military fusion, for example. And as you've seen the vaccine, global vaccine distribution and the way that China's out there selling, its vaccine to countries like Turkey and Brazil and Indonesia and donating it to places like Zimbabwe. I think it's going to be very important for our pharma companies to be out in global markets now, going head to head with Chinese companies that are backed by the Chinese state and sort of operating within this global pandemic environment towards, on some level, the Communist Party's goals for influence, especially in the emerging world. So it's a global competition too. It's not just partnership with government. It's understanding the global U.S.-China competition. That's where industry leaders, supply chain officers, strategists all need to need to begin to really understand that all very, very clearly and form strategy around that.
So I think that we take this back a year. Many folks would know the names, J&J, maybe Pfizer, but I don't think they would think of Moderna, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, as being those companies that were potentially standing between the life that many are leading today, double masking a lot now, to where we're going to get to. And you described that there's going to be this, need for the strength of the U.S., our corporate capabilities, and to step up. Are you getting that feeling that is it being heard across the corporate land? I'm not going to ask you for who's going to be the next, Moderna that, a year ago people would not have known who they are. And now it's, am I going to get Moderna? Am I going to get, Pfizer? Do you think that is being heard, and, that the political strife that we've, had is not masking or having our ears be closed to that? Are they going to step up? Are they ready to step up, or do they need another pandemic like jolt? Another, I don't know whether we want to call this a black swan or a white swan, but is it going to take something else to slap us in the face and know what it is, or are we already far enough down the road to know that that's where we need to go?
Well, I think it's still a very large process, and I think this is true across industries. At my company, Atlas Organization, that I founded, I work with executives across different strategic industries to help them deal with the problems of U.S.-China competition, understand how this is going to impact their strategy and how to reposition their businesses to succeed in a world that's going to be very different from the last 20 years. What I find is that there's companies still have a very global outlook. I mean, they're looking at sort of how do you repair the sort of fissures that are, coming in the global economy. But I think they're not yet necessarily seeing how clear this is going to be once there's a U.S.-China decoupling, which is another important subject. I mean, as the U.S. and Chinese economies sort of start to split apart on technology and critical industries, and as the economic competition really gets into high gear, at that point, I think it's going to be much more beneficial for our market leaders to really make a call on where this whole thing is going, realize that the power of the U.S. market is probably the most important thing, and at the end of the day, we're going to be in a very deep economic competition for which economy is larger and which is more influential globally. And also the U.S. alliance system is 2/3 of global GDP. So ultimately, as that, I think, becomes more and more of an economic community, as all of these states, whether it's Australia or Japan or in Europe or India, as they realize how misaligned the sort of geopolitical relationship with China is versus the sort of market access goals and trade relationships. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have to form a strong, stable economic community across the world's democracies. And I think that's going to change a lot for what it means to be a multinational corporation. I think being a multinational corporation, in a Cold War, in a second Cold War, is going to be quite a difficult thing to do. So corporates have to rethink that strategy. But I do believe that what they need to understand most is that their home is here. I mean, this is where all our big market leaders come from. And at the end of the day, our loyalties have to be to the United States of America. And it's up to us all, I think, to realize the full potential of the United States. Because as you head into the next horizons of industrial Internet of Things and just innovation in biopharmaceuticals and everything else. I mean, it really is going to be the United States. I think has a much we haven't peaked in any way, shape, or form, and it's going to be up to our companies, our sort of visionaries, and our government to sort of figure out how we're going to proceed as a country in a kind of second space race in China that takes shape not just in space, but in every strategic industry, whether that's pharma or auto or, additive manufacturing or robotics or just, I mean, we're going to have to do a lot of important building here. And a lot of that has to do with being able to reduce our vulnerabilities. I think government understands that very clearly. And that's going to have to be, really built by private industry. I've yet to see the full awakening there, but it's really what the problem means. It means that we're going to have to be so competitive versus China, and that's going to require our business leaders.
I only have a few minutes left, and I can keep going, but as a level set for folks, what you talk about, resonates for someone who grew up in a lot of different places, but calls the Northeast home, and has now decided to reside in Tennessee, about 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies just that way. There's a Volkswagen location that is going to be where they manufacture their electric cars. And I wonder, here in Tennessee and the surrounding states, just how much of that revitalization of the things that need to be manufactured and constructed are going to be constructed down here in my backyard. And I'm really thrilled about that. So I got one thing to sort of close on, and I want to go way off topic, but I'm fascinated as you talk about this separation, this fissure that's occurring between this, and it has to. And again, I'm not trying to say whether we're politically good or bad, but we're doing stimulus in the economy as we speak. There's ongoing discussion of how much more stimulus is going to be done. That does add to a likelihood that China will be taking more of our debt. How does that all play into that fissure, that separation between our two countries?
Well, at the end of the day, there's a serious financial component to all of this. I mean, it's one of our greatest strengths is the U.S. financial system and sort of national wealth in general. And the most important thing in my mind is for there to be such a strong investment case for America that you have not only corporate executives deciding to allocate here, but also investment banks, pension funds, everybody else deciding to allocate here. So I think that case has yet to be built. And one of the, I think, most important things in a bad way about what's happened in the pandemic is that China has come out of this surpassing the United States for the first time as a destination for FDI. So, right now you have our banks and, financiers really focused on the China market. I mean, it's in every, all kinds of Chinese companies are in MSCI and other benchmarks and such, and it's directing a whole lot of capital over to China. And the problem is that that's ultimately going to wind up in Chinese corporations that then start to go after our market leaders globally. So it's really a very self-destructive process to be capitalizing an adversary state. We need to be capitalizing, the United States, and I think that the decoupling process will we'll also have to have some constraints on investment into China. You've seen a little bit of that through investment bans. But, you really have to, I think that the wise long-term investor in all this has to understand the next decade is a U.S.-China economic competition, and we want to bet on our country.
This was truly fascinating. I'm out of time, sadly, but I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Ward, who is the founder and president of the Atlas organization, for his time during our Pharma and Healthcare Summit. This was a wide-ranging, fascinating discussion. I really want to thank you. I appreciate it. And my expectation is that FreightWaves down the road is going to ask you for more of your time and more of your really fascinating and stimulating thoughts. Thank you. Appreciate it, Dr. Ward. Really, really very much.
Thank you, George, and thank you to everyone at FreightWaves.
Thanks a bunch. Everybody, enjoy the rest of the summit. I appreciate everyone who is viewing, and make sure that you network, make sure that you're building those relationships through all the folks who are attending. Thanks again. Have a great day.